Welcome to ACR On Air, the official podcast of the American College of Rheumatology, where we have engaging conversations with leading rheumatology professionals on topics such as the latest research on rheumatic diseases, solutions for addressing practice management issues, legislative policies impacting patient care, and more. Here's your host.
Welcome back to another episode of ACR On Air, the official podcast of the American College of Rheumatology. I am your host, Dr. John Hausman. Show notes for this episode can be found at acronair.org. You can find our previous episodes on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, Stitcher Radio, and on your favorite podcast app. Today, we are revisiting the Great Debate from ACR Convergence 2020. If you remember, the question at the time was whether JAK inhibitors should be started before TNF inhibitors in people with rheumatoid arthritis who failed methotrexate. However, just a few short months after the debate in 2021, results from the oral surveillance trial showed an increased risk of major adverse cardiovascular events and cancers in patients with rheumatoid arthritis taking tofacitinib as compared to those on TNF inhibitors, which led the FDA to up their black box warning on JAK inhibitors. We've invited one of the speakers from the Great Debate, Dr. Vibeke Strand, to revisit her position on JAK inhibitors given these new results. Dr. Strand has been adjunct clinical professor in the Division of Immunology and Rheumatology at Stanford University School of Medicine since 1993. She also runs a consulting practice that offers clinical research and regulatory strategy expertise to pharmaceutical and biotech companies for the development of new therapies in rheumatic disease. She's participated in the development of all of the approved biologic agents and targeted synthetic DMARDs in RA. She's published extensively and has been in leadership committees for years. I hope you enjoy the show. Vibeke, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you very much.
So let's go back to 2020. If you remember those days, I'm sort of trying to forget that whole year. But it was ACR Convergence 2020. It had recently been converted from an in-person conference to a virtual conference. And the Great Debate considered the question whether JAK inhibitors should be used before biologics after failing methotrexate in people with rheumatoid arthritis. So on one side of the argument, Dr. Mike Weinblatt argued that TNFs should be started first because, we have 20 years experience with them, and any rare safety issue like the issues with worsening of demyelinating disease were already known. He also noted that they seem to be safe in pregnancy, and he ended his argument saying that biosimilars had recently been in the market and thus making the biologics less expensive. And then on the other side of the argument, you were in favor of using JAKs prior to TNF inhibitors. And you mentioned several arguments in favor of JAK inhibitors, including their efficacy and of course, some studies showing even superior efficacy as compared to TNF inhibitors. I think you also mentioned their rapid onset of action, ease of administration. I mean, the fact that you could take a pill by mouth instead of an injectable is huge for a lot of patients. And lastly, they're short half-life. So if you have to stop the drug is out of your system within a few days. I think at that time, there are already some safety issues. We know about the increased incidence of herpes zoster. We could mitigate that with the Shingrix vaccine. And at that time, the FDA had already placed a black box warning on JAK inhibitors regarding the increased risk of venous thromboembolism. And you mentioned that, perhaps for people with prior blood clots, you should consider other treatment options. And then, of course, in 2021, the FDA updated their black box warning after results from a large randomized safety clinical trial that showed an increased risk of heart attack, stroke, cancer, blood clots, and death when tofacitinib was compared against TNF inhibitors in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. And the warnings extended not just to tofacitinib, but also baricitinib and upadacitinib. We wanted to revisit, have these clinical trial findings and FDA warnings changed your mind about the use of JAK inhibitors in people with rheumatoid arthritis?
Well, that's a long question and a long answer. If you'll give
We
me a
have plenty of
second.
time. That's the great thing about podcasting.
So first of all, yes, I don't think it's fair to even consider using a JAK before a TNF inhibitor just based on the labeling. However, we still have patients who are relatively young and healthy and will not take a biologic or won't self-administer. And then we also have patients who don't have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, which is really what was uncovered in the population that was in oral surveillance. And we've had multiple abstracts, both at ACR and just recently at EULAR, one of them which actually looked at the whole tofacitinib RA program from phase 1 through phase 4 without including oral surveillance except as a comparison. And what they showed was that the higher those patients who had coronary artery disease were already at higher risk for MACEs, and that it wasn't as high as we saw in oral surveillance, but since oral surveillance was accruing patients who had at least 2 cardiovascular risk factors and they were above the age of 55, this was a high-risk population.
Aha.
And that does really explain the MACEs. But interestingly enough, it also explains the malignancies to some extent, because the majority of MACEs and malignancies were in past or current smokers in North America.
Aha.
And that, of course, gives you the lung cancers as well. So from that point of view, we could say, interesting. Also, I really do think that the trial was underpowered. The FDA gave Pfizer the numbers according to the INTRACT study, which was the study of tocilizumab safety, cardiovascular safety, versus etanercept. And there it was shown non-inferiority. But that was in a population now almost 10 years ago, and we already know that every decade our RA patients are healthier. They have fewer risk factors and less cardiovascular disease. And so, in a sense, this was a increased risk population and then probably too small numbers. And we still got non-inferiority, but those definitions were quite strict. And then what I have to ask you is, what do you say about a hazard ratio for the 5 milligram dose of 1.15 for MACEs and 1.47 for malignancies? I mean, usually we don't get concerned until we're above 2 for a hazard ratio.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, it's a number needed to harm. It'd be 567 patients per year to show that difference for MACEs, and it would be 276 patients per year to show malignancies.
Wow.
And that translates into much smaller numbers that have to be treated for a complete 5 years per patient to see these kinds of risks.
Huh. So do you think, in a sense, that the FDA may be overreacting or overreading the results of this trial?
Well, I'm not going to say that, but I am going to say that FDA is very conservative, especially our division.
That's a better term. More
The
conservative.
Division of Rheumatology and Transplant Medicine has been quite conservative because of the history in rheumatology.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah, we had binoxaprofen that was launched as a new nonsteroidal, and 3 months later it was taken off the market because all these liver episodes had not been reported.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the COX-2 wars and goodbye to rofecoxib and goodbye to valdecoxib. And so I think they've always felt like our diseases are not immediately fatal or may not ever be fatal. And so they have to be conservative. And then in the past fall of 2021, the FDA released a draft guidance document that talked about labeling. And what they said was, instead of just labeling for the product that was currently approved and the current indication it was approved for, they were now going to label for theoretical off-label possible uses, and also what might be the impact of the product if you had a pandemic. Now, I don't know how you write a label for safety based on all those hypotheses. But as you can understand it, that may help to explain why the label for TOFA based on oral surveillance was now applied to both baricitinib and upadacitinib, but it's also been applied to all the JAKs in dermatologic indications and hematologic indications, except for the requirement to fail a TNF inhibitor first.
Wow. So it sounds pretty broad statements from the FDA based on this one specific trial with one specific drug for one specific patient population, being not just people with rheumatoid arthritis, but people with rheumatoid arthritis at increased risk of cardiovascular events. That I totally hear how that can be seen as very conservative by the FDA. I have a patient, she's in her early 20s, and we've been wanting to start a biologic for a long time, but she has over and over refused. And I think part of it has to do with biologics sound scary and the fact that it's an injectable medication and she's in college and sort of the practicality of that. She has not wanted to start a biologic and has continued to have active disease over several months. And most recently, I tried to get her a JAK inhibitor and have been fighting with insurance companies to try to get that approved. And I guess my questions is, do you think that's a patient where JAK inhibitors may be used in prior to TNF inhibitors? Or how are you thinking about which patients could still benefit from JAK inhibitors without experiencing the increased risk of adverse events?
So I think it's a very good question. And I think my answer would be yes. I think it would be a good patient. It's a young patient. She doesn't have the risk factors, and she may never develop them if we can treat her effectively early. The other part of it is the STAR-RA trial, right? Which was 102,000 patients from the Medicare and Optum and one other database. And they looked at all these patients who had started TOFA versus all patients who'd started a TNF, and they compared them. And it was up through 2020 from 2012. And even when they matched the patient population to the oral surveillance inclusion-exclusion criteria, they still did not come up with statistical non-inferiority for MACEs or malignancies comparing TOFA to the TNF inhibitors. And so that's a real-world study, and that's a large number of patients. And although you can't rule out the possibility, it's certainly not looking at the population that's at high risk. These are more, with the exception of the Medicare database, which was the third one, these are generally younger patients, and most of them don't share all the risk factors. And so that, plus some other data we've seen from registries like the Rabbit registry in Germany, have failed to show these kinds of risks. So from that point of view, I think it's very reasonable. It's a long fight because you're going against a label. But the labels are supposed to be advisory.
Yeah, I mean, the FDA sort of answered our great debate and said that no, in order to start JAK inhibitors, you need to have failed or be intolerant of TNF inhibitors, right?
Yeah, but that was after new data. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. After new data, the FDA weighed in on our great debate. That's really challenging because, as you mentioned, for people that may not be at increased cardiovascular risk, JAK inhibitors still do present a great option, especially for people that don't want to do injectable drugs.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's also important because there's plenty of patients who are working and traveling and have all sorts of other things, just like your patient who's a student and doesn't want to have injectables and deal with all of that. And, if they don't have those risk factors, then I think we should be able to win the prior authorization fight.
Got it.
But that's going to be a lot of work for you.
I know. Well, that's a whole other episode about prior authorizations. But it sounds like in people that don't have increased cardiovascular risk, in non-smokers, maybe in people that haven't had, malignancy, which tend to be sort of the younger crowd, it sounds like the safety signal of JAK inhibitors may be comparable to TNF inhibitors. Is that the type of patient that you would think about starting a JAK inhibitor first, or just prescribing a JAK inhibitor in general?
Well, in general, I would feel much more comfortable with these patients. We also have patients who For a variety of reasons, we should still be thinking about a JAK. Preferably, they failed a biologic so that that concern is no longer quite so obvious. I think it's interesting because patients haven't come to us so much worrying about this label as we've been told to worry about it for them.
That's right.
And I'm not arguing against the label because I think it does need to be there.
But you're totally right. I don't think I've had a patient saying like, oh, I heard about, the increased adverse effects on JAK inhibitor. Can you get me off? I think partly maybe they haven't heard about it, or perhaps they're happy enough with their drug that they don't want to change. What are you doing with people that are already on JAK inhibitors in light of this evidence? Do you discuss these findings with patients, and do you ever consider switching at least some of them to a different drug?
That's a tough question. Yes, we discuss it with them. And I say we because I'm seeing patients as an attending in the clinic. And so I'm with the fellow and we're talking with the patient, or I'm with the resident. But we do always try to make sure we've had that discussion. So far, I don't remember anyone who wanted to change therapy, but a lot of them had already failed a biologic. And that was part of the reason they liked the JAK inhibitors so well. I think the other part of it is that, yeah, you have to be thinking about the individual patient. There's no such thing as looking at therapeutic armamentarium across the disease as one thing. We've been highly individualistic about how we treat every patient with every disease we treat. So that's what we need to do here. Unfortunately, we just have a lot of arguments about approval, prior authorization, et cetera. But I definitely think in young working and also young student patients that these are really a very good option for treatment.
So trying to mitigate some of the risks of this drug, we discussed initially about, perhaps getting Shingrix to try to prevent the development of shingles in these patients, of herpes zoster. Are there other screenings that you do prior to starting JAK inhibitors that we should think about?
Well, I mean, we always do TB, and I definitely think that it's important to get the Shingrix, but you can give it after the treatment has started.
Yeah.
At least that's been shown with the JAKs. I think that otherwise, it's really a matter of making sure they don't smoke, and that includes vaping and all of that, which can be a discussion in this population.
Yes.
I think that there's certainly a role, depending on the age of the patient and so on, as to whether they've had a full cardiovascular workup and whether they may be at risk. I think you do have to worry about co-medications, right? We know that DVT-PEs are associated with immune-mediated inflammatory diseases in general, but they're also increased when you're using hormone replacement, or you're taking birth control pills, or you have lung disease or whatever. So all of those things are important to consider as well. But can use an oral anticoagulant in combination if necessary. But I'm not here to advocate using JAK inhibitors not taking into account the labeling. I'm simply talking about how, if you're able to ascertain that this isn't a high-risk population, then we shouldn't think that these risks will emerge because it is specific to a certain population.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point. So it's not that we should never use JAK inhibitors. We should just be selective about who would benefit the most and have the least risk of using these drugs. Because, for some patients, they've tried the other stuff and it may not be effective. And JAK inhibitors may be effective and may be particularly great for patients because of their ease of administration. That seems very reasonable, that it's not a drug for everybody, but for some select number of patients that could be very useful. Can we talk a little bit about the cost of JAK inhibitors? I mean, it seems pretty crazy to me that a little pill costs, the same as a biologic. And in my mind, creating a biologic is much more complex than creating a pill. What are your thoughts about the cost of these drugs and whether that could come down sometime in the future?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, I definitely hope they come down in the future. I hope when tofacitinib becomes generic, we will see that soon. I think part of the issue is the cost of making it is not really the cost. It's the cost of development.
Yep.
And if you think about it, look at the large number of trials done just in RA with each of the JAK inhibitors that are approved. And then look at, there's at least one, maybe two trials in PSA. There's at least three trials with upadacitinib in SPA and two with tofacitinib. So that's part of the cost. Do I think it's fair that they should be the same price as a biologic? And the answer is no, but I don't think the biologic should be that expensive either.
Okay.
And then I wish we had the biosimilars actually available in the United States.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, patent issues are going to preclude that until next year. But hopefully we'll see them next year.
Yeah, that's a whole other discussion. But yeah, I think that's a fair point. Hopefully in the future with the development of generic drugs, the prices of some of these JAK inhibitors will come down. Any other thoughts about JAK inhibitors? It sounds like, in selected patient population, they may be a very good option. And I think the indications seem to be expanding, right? It started with rheumatoid and I think ulcerative colitis, and it's bounced around and psoriatic arthritis, I think spondyloarthritis, and other indications, which is pretty fantastic. Are there other diseases for which JAK inhibitors may be useful in the future?
Yeah, well, so already there's approvals in atopic dermatitis.
That's right.
So upadacitinib and abrocitinib was just approved. And then there's a topical ruxolitinib. Ruxolitinib is the drug that's been used in myelofibrosis since 2011. And there's two more JAKs in myelofibrosis, fedratinib and pacritinib. And ruxolitinib is now approved in acute as well as chronic GVHD. And we have upadacitinib in ulcerative colitis as well. And then don't forget, baricitinib was approved actually for 14 days treatment of COVID.
Oh, that's right.
And tofacitinib is approved for polyarticular JIA.
That's right. Yeah, I certainly have had some kids on tofacitinib, and they've been doing great. That's great. What do you think? You have a lot of experience in working with pharmaceutical companies. What do you see sort of coming down the line that gets you excited about new drugs or new targets for treatment of rheumatic and musculoskeletal diseases?
Avacopan was just approved last year for AAV, ANCA-associated vasculitis, and I think we're going to see more of these types of complement inhibitors, hopefully in lupus as well as other diseases. I think that would be quite exciting. There's still more things happening just in RA. There is anti-GM-CSF, otilimab, and then there's others that are still, making their progress. I hope we're going to get a JAK ultimately in lupus even, although baricitinib failed. I'm not sure it was the product as much as the differences in trial design, et cetera, and how challenging lupus is. All of this is really exciting when you think how we've got more therapies almost than any other subspecialty except oncology. And of course, we have more diseases to treat too, but it's really nice to consider that even though our diseases are not generally fatal, they are chronic diseases and they definitely need therapies. And so we essentially have an unmet need in every disease we treat.
That's totally right. I think I've also heard about JAK inhibitors in the treatment of interferonopathies and some autoinflammatory disorders. I've heard it for like HLH and macrophage activation syndrome, like ruxolitinib. Yeah, so I think
and dermatomyositis.
And dermatomyositis, yeah, that's right. With interferon pathways that may be involved in these. I guess that's why for lupus it may be useful. It sucks when the idea of a drug seems to be perfect for a disease and then you try it out and it doesn't work. And it seems like for lupus that happens over and over and over again with almost any drug that you try.
Yeah, except now we have 3 approved in 2 in lupus nephritis, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it's great. Awesome. Well, Vibeke, this has been a really wonderful conversation and an update to our great debate from a couple of years ago. Thank you so much for your expertise, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it, the Great Debate 2020 version 2.0. Thank you all for listening, downloading, subscribing to our show, and for rating us with 5 stars, or however many stars you think we deserve. Please tell all your friends, frenemies, and colleagues about our podcast. We'd love to hear from you about new topics and potential guests, as well as any other suggestions you may have. Please email us at podcast@rheumatology.org or send us a tweet at ACR Rheum. You can find show notes for this episode on acronair.org. You can also find us on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and on your favorite podcasting app. Until next time, keep debating, and as always, stay healthy.
Loved this episode of ACR On Air? Then be sure to subscribe at acronair.org and join us every third Tuesday for new episodes. Thanks for listening.